Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabeg, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. There's broad agreement amongst most supporters of radical social change around the world that where people stand on the Israeli state's genocidal actions against Palestinians in Gaza, along with Israel's oppression of Palestinians in the West Bank and inside 48, in other words, Israel's 1948 borders, is an important test of their political outlook. Much the same is true about how people respond to U.S. aggression against Venezuela and Cuba and to the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. But there isn't such agreement when it comes to the all-out war between Russia and Ukraine that's been ongoing since February 2022. But if you acknowledge that the ruling classes of the United States and the advanced capitalist societies of Western Europe, so-called Canada, and Australia, Israel, and others in what we could call the West, are not the only ones capable of harming people in other countries, you can't escape the question of how we should relate to Russia's war on Ukraine. So we could say that there's a Ukraine test, too. This has implications for us in a world in which U.S. power is declining, China's is rising, and even though Russia's power is nothing like the U.S.'s or China's, Russia's rulers have shown themselves more than willing to wield that power aggressively. So I'm glad to be joined on this episode by two guests, one of whom has been on Victor's Children twice before, and one of whom I'm happy to be talking with for the first time. Could you introduce yourselves to the listeners, please?
Yeah, hello. My name's Simon Pirani. I'm speaking to you from the UK. I have a lifelong involvement in the labour movement and have started travelling to Russia and Ukraine and other former Soviet countries at the end of the Soviet period in 1990. I wrote a book about Soviet workers and the communists in the 1920s. That was published in 2008, and I've carried on writing about Russia and Ukraine since. Most recently, I edited a collection of speeches by anti-war protesters in Russian courts that was published last year.
Volodymyr?
I'm Volodymyr Artiukh. I'm a sociologist and anthropologist based in the UK. Likewise, I'm working on labor and migration in Eastern Europe, and I have penned some commentaries on the situation in Ukraine and the war in particular.
Thanks. So to start off, let's briefly establish a basic understanding of this current war for listeners. As I see it, the all-out war that started in 2022 began as a war of Russian imperialist aggression, and it also quickly became caught up in conflict between the Russian state and Western states, which we can see as inter-imperialist rivalry. The shape of that rivalry has shifted since Trump took office for the second time in the United States in 2025 and then reoriented the U.S.'s stance towards Russia. But I think the political character of the war has remained mainly a war of imperialist aggression. So I guess my first question is, do you agree with that? How do you see the war and also the events that led up to the invasion in 2022?
I agree with you, David, that predominantly this is a war of imperialist aggression. There's also this element of inter-imperialist rivalry, but I think it's useful to think about what the term inter-imperialist rivalry means in this case, and what's the nature of Russian imperialism. From the breakup of the Soviet Union was a turning point. It put an end to a particular form of Russian imperial domination of its neighboring countries. And economically, from the 1990s, Russian capital began to be integrated into the world system in a clearly subordinate role. As an exporter of raw materials, the economy and the state budget was completely dependent on the proceeds of those exports, and the economic domination of Ukraine and to some extent Belarus on one hand, and the Baltics, and on the other hand, the Central Asian countries by Russia was weakened, and China came into Central Asia. Ukraine became more embraced into the European economic space. And really, we could tell the story of, in my view, we could tell the story of Vladimir Putin as compensating for this economic weakness with a strong state, acting in the first decade of the 21st century as a gendarme for international capital in Russia. And during that decade, Russia and the Western powers were talking to each other about possible forms of cooperation, and that really went on until you could say that a turning point was Putin's speech at Munich, when he denounced the idea of a unipolar world and so on. And against a background of oil prices going up, the oil companies becoming very rich, money flowing not only into the state budget, but also living standards improving. And then comes the global financial crash, which wipes out a lot of that economic progress. And it's against a background of economic malaise and mounting discontent in civil society, not only in Russia, but in Belarus, Ukraine, elsewhere, that I think you see the dictatorial and revanchist imperialist instincts coming out very strongly in the Russian state. And that takes its sharpest form in the conflicts between Russia and Ukraine, which start from, you could say, from 2004 with the so-called Orange Revolution and reach a height at the time of the events of Maidan. This very confused, I don't even know what's the right word, this confused uprising, you could call it, of very heterogeneous politically, against a government which favored cooperation with Russia and led to Yanukovych departing. And then, of course, you get the occupation of Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea. And I think one of the, if we're talking about the Western left, I was amazed from that time about people's ability to blank out the reality of what was happening in the occupied territories, which so clearly and so quickly turned into kind of tin pot dictatorship, very, very brutal and cruel. So I think, that it's really important to think about that, because if we talk about inter-imperialist rivalry and we forget just how weak economically Russia was as a power at the beginning of this process, we don't have the right kind of coloring of that. I suppose the last thing I'd say is you said that the shape of that rivalry has shifted since Trump took office. I mean, I'm kind of agnostic about this, and I'm anything but an expert on great power relations and so on. But I have heard comrades and colleagues who know much more about this stuff than I do saying, well, actually, there's the kind of Trump performance on one hand, but then there's the people in the State Department and in the American ruling class, and they haven't really changed their view that much. And that they're obviously, from their point of view, I mean, there are those who want to reach a new kind of rapprochement with Russia, and there are arguments about how to do that. But, perhaps the broader picture has changed a bit less than you'd think by watching Trump on television.
Volodymyr, what would you like to say about this?
I broadly agree with what Simon has just said, and with your initial formulation. I would just add that the full-scale Russia-Ukrainian war has always been multi-layered all along to the war in Donbass, which started in 2014, and that war was also a combination of regional, interstate, and international conflicts, where gradually the interstate component gained salience and culminated in the Russian invasion. But obviously, this whole has been happening in the field of tensions of the rivalry that was that has not yet reached, obviously, the height that it is now. And indeed, in the early days of the war, there were the decisions of the Russian and the Ukrainian political elites, as well as the resources that they had, that defined the course of the war. However, the global relations of forces became dominant and determinant in terms of how the war is shaped. By now, we could clearly state that Ukraine is dependent on the Western allies in all respects, from weapons, training, intelligence, and logistics to financial support of its economy in the rear. And I also agree with Simon that with the advent of Trump's administration, it only became clear that this war has shifted more to Europe. It has become a European affair, but it seems to me that this shift has been foreshadowed before. And not only did the burden of financing Ukraine shift to Europe, the rhetoric enveloping this dependency, Ukraine's dependency, simply lost its moralistic embellishment, as it, in the style of Trump-dominated global politics. Both European and Ukrainian political elites now discuss this war in terms of a civilizational conflict between Russia and the West, where Ukraine plays a role of a shield that blunts Russia's claws and buys time for Europe to increase its military spending, which is Trump's demand, and regain its sort of status as a global geopolitical player, which European elites has been deploring. The loss of which European elites has been deploring. So we see, studying the rhetoric of Europeans, of European elites, we see that the slogans of support Ukraine until victory are things of the past. Now we see a very cynical transactional relationship between Ukraine and the West. I would probably end my response with a slightly provocative statement that although morally we may and we probably should compare the suffering of the Ukrainian and Palestinian people, politically Ukraine or Israel find themselves now in analogous positions vis-a-vis Europe and the US. Both countries are external militarized foreposts in what is perceived as a civilizational clash. And this structural similarity is not lost on the Ukrainian elites and intellectuals who envisioned the future of Ukraine as the Israel of Eastern Europe. So it is obviously true that the war was a result of the premeditated and deliberate Russian aggression, but its dynamic is now determined in a much more complex way than it looked to us in 2022. Thank you.
Thanks. Before we move on, I do want to just pick up maybe from that last point and just bring up this question about the relationship between the war as a war of Russian imperialist aggression and inter-imperialist rivalry. Because if we broadly understand that there are these dimensions happening, there's at the same time, there are some comrades who would agree with that, but would argue that now the inter-imperialist rivalry dynamic is decisive and outweighs, the element of Russian imperialist aggression, and so they draw different political conclusions about the war from that. Any response you'd like to offer to that analysis, which would that you'd like to share now?
I think what Volodya, what you've said is indeed provocative, but it's analysis. You've spoken about the way that the relationships between the Western powers and Ukraine have changed over the course of the 4 years. And I would broadly agree with your points. I would like to think a bit more about the way you describe the ideological changes in European bourgeoisie. But, that's analysis. But a lot of what I hear in left-wing organizations is not analysis, it's politics. And it's politics in quite a kind of impoverished sense of the word, that you have leftists sitting here, for example, in the UK, and they see the US and its allies as the main and in some senses the only ill in the world, the only enemy. And they believe even now that states that oppose the Western alliance are somehow deserving of, I don't even not support, but some kind of sympathy. I was drawn back, thinking about this podcast and what we were going to talk about. And in 2014, this is just to take an example, our people here in the Stop the War Coalition, who one thinks of if we're talking about campists, had very, very little to say about the Russian intervention in the very confused conflict in eastern Ukraine in 2014. They had very little to say about the annexation of Crimea. But one person who I've had a lifelong admiration for, Eamon McCann, is a wonderful journalist who lives in Derry and understands a bit more about war than most people in Western Europe because he lives there and has been active there politically all his life, published an article in which he said, if we have to take sides, Ireland should side with the Russians. And I think he was being honest and saying what many, many people in sort of leftist milieu were thinking. And I tried unsuccessfully to have a discussion with Eamon about it, either in written form or some other form. And I think that's also very kind of symptomatic, that it's almost impossible to have a proper discussion. And the other example I would point to is not Ukraine, but Syria, which is a truly shocking example of this sort of state of mind. So that between 2011 and 2018, when the Syrian regime was killing hundreds of thousands of its own citizens because they didn't like the form of government, there were many, many voices in the Western leftist organizations that were literally completely silent, and suddenly organized demonstrations and so on when the Western powers made these very half-hearted and very partial interventions in Syria. They bomb a couple of airfields and so on. And so for bombing a couple of airfields, we would have a big demonstration on the street in London, whereas the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of civilians had gone by without anybody saying anything. And in Layla Al-Shami, in her article, which was very widely publicized in 2018 about the anti-imperialism of idiots, made the point that 90-something% of the civilian victims of the whole Syrian civil war up to that point were victims of the regime and its Russian supporters, and just about the same proportion of noise from Western left-wing groups had been on the other side. And this is an enormous kind of failure of anything that we could possibly call socialism. Indeed, I tried to stop using the words "the left" at the time. What is the left? Which includes people who, at best stand by and say nothing when this horrendous massacre of working class protesters is taking place, and at worst express some sort of sympathy with the executioners. So I think, anyway, just to round that up, I think there's a difference between analysis, which we have to analyze and keep looking again and again at how this how the inter-imperialist element of what's going on in Ukraine fits with the Russian imperialist onslaught on not only the Ukrainian state, but on the Ukrainian population, how the Ukrainian population as well as the Ukrainian state reacts to that. So we have to continually, of course, try to understand how those relationships are changing, But I think we also have to be honest about the Western left, that a lot of what passes for analysis is actually digging out the facts to suit a political position which you've taken because it suits what you're doing in your own country, instead of thinking about the problems facing workers in Ukraine or Russia or Syria.
Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I obviously agree with what you've with your observations regarding the statements that you sometimes hear from let's call this people self-described progressives for the lack of better word, and it seems to me that it's slightly changing, but I agree with you that largely the level and sophistication of analysis of the ongoing war has not been satisfactory. But to be honest with you, it's not just the problem of the left, which is objectively impoverished in terms of resources everywhere. It's also to a large extent the case in academia, the place which receives money to do this, to produce analysis, and unfortunately, and I'm included in this. This has not been. The people on the academic side have really not been up to task, I would say, and this is visible in. We could dedicate another hour for this, but I will return to the question that you posed, David. This is the question of sort of distributing weights, or as you formulated, what factors outweighs imperialist aggression or inter-imperialist rivalry. If by outweighing you mean that the Russian war of aggression should be understood as a defensive, and some people, as I remember, did regard it like this, then this of course contradicts the facts and the perception of this war by the Russian elites themselves. If you read carefully how they speak and what they say, they are quite clear and honest that this is a war of conquest or reconquest, as they formulated. And this war has been Russian deliberate move in anticipation of the intensified inter-imperialist rivalry, in an attempt not to remain on the sidelines as the conflict between the US and China intensified and Europe was sort of hanging out there in between. So it was a proactive move, and it was of course not a response to an immediate danger of an attack. And as Simon pointed out, it stemmed from the disequilibrium in the resources available to the Russian elites. These were not economic resources, but mostly military. Thus, in terms of the chain of events and the intentionality of this decision-making, this war was an aggressive war. It was a sort of check, move in the sort of geopolitical game of chess, gambit in a sense. But it was in the middle of a larger party or set of chess games. This is how war originated, but the way it developed is now determined not solely by the agency of the Russian elites or the decision of the Ukrainian elites. Social processes, long-term social processes such as wars, they can't be reduced to one event that just unleashes them, and this original scene can be blamed for any consequences at this or that moment in time. The Russian elites are now locked in a path dependency of the Putin's original decision. That's true, and neither this ruling circle nor the next generation of Russian rulers will be able to return to the status quo ante, that is, to reestablish sort of the same type of sub-imperialist or dependent imperialist development. The Ukrainian state, meanwhile, is virtually completely dependent on the Western support in all respects, as I said before, and this dependency has obviously only increased. And of course, much of the decision making regarding the goals of waging this war is determined by this dependency of the Ukrainian state. So in a certain sense, this is definitely now Europe's war and America's war. And the constraints on decision-making by the Ukrainian elites, the constraints imposed by the West, by the dependency on the West, is huge. This, of course, is not to deny that the ruling elites in Ukraine and Israel, for example, or other countries like Turkey, who are kind of peripheral players, that they will not use the leverages available to them as indispensable clients in order to defend their own corporate interests. Thus, whereas the Russo-Ukrainian war has been a Russian aggression, and this is still the crucial component that drives the war in a certain respect. Now, it is not immediately clear what sort of defensive war is now waged on the part of Ukraine and the West. The goals are co-determined, and the availability of resources are not determined by one single agency. So in this sense, not in a simplistic fashion, we can't claim that this war has turned into some sort of defensive war by Russia. But in a certain sense, this is not the same war, simple interstate war of aggression that it was in the first month of 22. Thank you.
Thanks for that. It's, I think, giving people a lot of food for thought. I'd like to move now to talk about something which has already been brought up, but to maybe focus a little bit more on the politics around this within the so-called West and within the so-called left. So to start with, since 2022, there have been people, a whole current of people on the left in societies like ours who more or less echo what Western governments have been saying about the war. So they say that Russia, Putin is awful, which is undeniably true. They point to Ukrainian suffering, which is also obviously real. And they then argue that Western states should provide military aid to Ukraine, but they say little or nothing critical about Western policy towards Ukraine or towards Russia, for that matter, or about the Ukrainian government. And they've gone along with calls for and moves towards increased military spending in Europe, the US, and Canada, and even in some cases supporting moves towards conscription, which are being supposedly justified by the supposed Russian threat, even if they might have some reservations. You could call this, pro-Western campism, if you like. Could you comment a little bit on this kind of politics and its implications? I know this is certainly quite pronounced in parts of the left in Britain.
I think it all depends on what you mean by the left. The Labour Party, I don't think it means anything to talk about the Labour Party as a party as part of the left. And we are in the UK at the end of this long, really 4 decades of this stage of the crisis of social democracy. The Blair government was a huge turning point, which was responsible for the war in Iraq, together with the Bush administration in the US. The left of the Labour Party very clearly opposed the Iraq war, and I think what's left of that small left-wing contingent of the Labour Party has been very, very vocal on Palestine. Jeremy Corbyn and the people around him. Corbyn is no longer in the Labour Party, but John McDonnell is. So I think, I mean, the person I can think of who's voiced those politics that you're talking about most clearly, David, is Paul Mason, who clearly was part of the left, but is not in any recognisable sense. He's made himself into some sort of expert on defence policy, but he's not. We don't see him at the sort of meetings or gatherings of the left, such as they are. He has been very clear that he's proud of the Labour Party because of its support for Israel. But I think many people would regard that kind of position as the position of a renegade. So so I think we're talking about what is the what do we mean by the left? And I mean, I think the other point is that is a sort of, your question about this makes me sort of think about the left as a sociological entity, that people find it very easy to go to trade union conferences with the right-wing trade unions that have members in the defence sector. So that's the GMB union in particular in the UK. And obviously these resolutions about supporting Ukraine fly through without a lot of thought being given by anybody. But equally, those same people in the Labour Party pay absolutely no attention whatsoever to the vast amount of activity by Ukrainians living in the UK supporting either on a sort of civil society basis or supporting the army directly. I mean, you can go to, and I have done, you can go to sort of events that are basically sort of business conferences about Ukraine and chat to people in the break about their charity, which is raising, hundreds of thousands of pounds or euros for drones for the front. Now, whatever you think of that, and whatever you think about those sort of initiatives, or about our middle-class Ukrainian friends who live locally, who it's a French-Ukrainian family, and since the beginning of the war, they've been driving big vehicles to Lviv full of medical supplies and everything, leaving the vehicles there, coming home again. Now, whatever you think about that, and that itself is a whole discussion, there's no pretense by the Labour Party members who go and pass their resolutions of any interest in, what these Ukrainians are doing, or what any Ukrainians are doing. This support for the position of the UK government, which has been, which has been pretty strong in its support of the Ukrainian government, is simply that. It's support for the UK government.
George, anything you'd like to add?
Indeed, it doesn't make sense to talk about the left in general in these respects. But I think I understand whom you have in mind when asking this question above. There are definitely some smaller groups that basically have. That are basically a sort of single cause movement who describe themselves as solidarity groups with Ukraine and so on, and definitely that they kind of build their progressive identity as the people who demand larger, more delivery of weapons to Ukraine and more support and so on. But to be honest, it has never been clear to me what the value of such form of support coming from a tiny marginalized group that many such leftist groups are. And I don't mean only the UK, although definitely such groups exist there, but also Eastern Europe, Poland. We are not here talking only about the UK politics. This sort of activism might have had some meaning in the first months of the war, when the extent of the Western involvement was not clear, or it was not revealed, in fact. But now this boils down to simply expressing overwhelming trust in Western elites, overwhelming trust in how they imagine and manage foreign politics. So the statement, "send more weapons to Ukraine," coming from the mouth of a leftist now, has no other meaning than we trust our government in how it handles foreign politics, because that's basically is a common sense now that the West sends weapons to Ukraine, and the only thing that remains is just to trust. That was, by the way, a suggestion or recommendation made by one of Ukrainian intellectuals, Kravchenko, who is more or less on the left, and he said that the the wisest strategy for the left now would be just to not interfere, just to let the mainstream do its job, and that's how many progressive groups see their tactics. And unfortunately, for some, this indeed has become a single cause politics that sometimes doesn't sit well with their local constituencies in Western countries or in their relationship with other left-wing groups. So but it's most. I would mostly say that this kind of tactics of position taking is very contingent and local. It should be analyzed and done locally. Thank you.
I will just add that on this side of the Atlantic, this kind of a position, I think, is taken by people like Bernie Sanders in the U.S. There's social democrats in the U.S. and in the Canadian state who have this kind of position, and they're located in a different place than the Labour Party is, right? Just because of the degeneration of the Labour Party and its role in government and so on is very different than social democracy and inside imperialist North America. So let's move on and talk about a kind of politics which Simon in particular had focused on earlier, we should say more about, which is really the mirror image of the pro-Western, quote-unquote, left position. And so here we have the politics of many, but not all, opponents of Western imperialism inside the West. And so it's from these people that we often hear that the war was caused by NATO expansion, and therefore that the real aggressors were the states that made up NATO, and so the Russian state was in some sense defending itself. And you also hear from such voices that it's a proxy war in the sense that the Ukrainian forces are fighting on behalf of Western imperialism against a country that they see as supposedly not imperialist. And then from this kind of analysis, some draw the conclusion that Russia actually deserves the active political sympathy or support of anti-imperialists because it's supposedly weakening Western imperialism through this war. It's a really the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of politics. So is there anything more that you would like to add about this kind of really unfortunate politics?
I think maybe in answer to this question, it would be useful to probe Volodya's comparison of Ukraine and Israel a little bit, because Israel, after the friction between the Zionists and the British Empire, so going back to the 1930s and 40s, once the State of Israel was founded, and once we get into the post-war period, it becomes an outpost for Western imperialism. It's very heavily armed by Western imperialism, and it's based, of course, from the start, from before the foundation of the State of Israel, on ethnic cleansing. And that's the whole point of the research by Ilan Pape and these other historians who've shown that in very great detail. So that's a very, very lengthy period of time which this form of settler colonialism has been fostered by the West. So we can probably all agree that in this sense, the history with Ukraine is obviously completely different. And Ukraine has been some form of Russian colony or divided between colonizers from the West and the North in different ways through its history, and achieving a large degree of what were then called national rights around the time of the Russian Revolution, and then comes into the post-Soviet period as one of the bits of the Soviet Union, which falls away through the will of it. I would say very much through the will of its own population. There's a question which I've never completely got my head around in the years of this war, which is what it means to talk about national liberation in the 21st century. I became very, very long before this Russian invasion of 2022. I myself became very skeptical about the meaning of that phrase in our socialist thinking and in the documents of socialist organizations, first of all, there clearly are issues of national self-determination, which stem from the very aggressive form of sort of neo-colonialism that we see from Moscow. There's also, on a political level, there's just the issue of Ukrainians' right to defend themselves from what I think we all agree here is imperialist aggression. I just have a question in my mind as to how that all maps onto the comparison of Ukraine and Israel, which I think has got to be a very limited one, if indeed it makes any sense. I have to say, David, I haven't really answered your question there. I've slightly changed the subject, but I think this is an interesting thing to talk about. I go on about the Stop the War Coalition for hours, but I think even some of your listeners have probably, heard plenty of that already.
Thanks. Volodymyr, how would you like to respond to Simon there?
I think that's an apt observation, and obviously any comparison is limited, and it's useful only up to a point. We may as well develop a comparison of Israeli and Russian politics, and there obviously would be plenty. And there would be plenty of similarities even in the habitus, in the sort of style of behavior of the Israeli and Russian leadership and some of the formulas that they use. That is definitely the case. But also what is the case is that many in the Ukrainian elite and Ukrainian intellectuals do see themselves as a sort of Eastern European followers of Israeli military might and of their acute national, ethnic, and religious and state consciousness. So, subjectively, this comparison has very firm ground in the ideology of the elites. And this is something that is easily accessible to anyone who reads Ukrainian political commentaries and statements. And this is this may not have a reality in the historical development of both countries, but it does have reality in the ideological projects of the ruling elites. Israeli ruling elite, they understand themselves obviously as victims, not as perpetrators of genocide, and denying genocidal roots is obviously part of the ideology that lies beneath the development of the military might and the whole dynamic of relationship between Israel and the West. Likewise, Ukrainian elites and many Eastern European elites have borrowed this template of ethnically determined, ethnically clean state that has suffered through generations, through ages and millennia, and then found its inner strength to establish a state that would be civilizationally higher. So this has been a template for Eastern European nationalist project, including Ukrainian nationalist project. So there is a comparison there in terms of, yes, and I have to stress it, in terms of the self-awareness of the elites and of the political projects that they entertain. On a different level of analysis, there may be more differences than similarities, but you cannot discount these differences if we discuss the current balance of forces and the possible attitudes of left-wing groups towards what's going on. What concerns the second question, and now I will pass the ball to Simon. What concerns your original question, David, on some admiration or sympathy towards Russian elites, towards Russian on, I don't know, Russian state. It has never been. I have never understood how it's ever possible. Russia was one of the most reactionary countries, and it suppresses both the people whom it conquers, but also its own population, including many Russian left-wing groups and individuals, and obviously I can only send the people who admire Russia to the Russian left-wing intellectuals and activists and ask them to talk and figure it all out. And I know that Simon does a lot in this domain, and he has recently helped publish and edited a book on the plight of the Russian prisoners, Russian political prisoners.
So I think if I can add 2 points. First of all, there's a discussion which probably we can't have on this podcast, not least because Volodya, you know far more about it than I do. But I think, but from what you've said, I would have a question about the extent of an ethnically based nationalism in the Ukrainian elite. I mean, my understanding, I certainly had all sorts of illusions about the potential for Ukraine to develop as a multi-language and multi-nationality state. And I was looking at this issue through rose-colored spectacles. I thought until 2014, I thought, okay, I walk around Kiev, I speak Russian, I can't speak Ukrainian, nobody cares. Maybe this is all in the past. And of course, this is completely wrong. Clearly, there's an element of the conflict from 2014 and the element of and in the war as it has developed, where these tensions between different national groups are exacerbated. And of course, I don't have any doubt at all about the existence of an ethnic nationalism in Ukraine. It's there, just as it's there in a lot of other countries. The question is how strong it is as a dominant ideology. So to me, it's just a question to which I don't know the answer. And the second thing is how different these things look if you're looking at it from a point of view of Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian elite or Ukrainian working people. And on the other hand, the situation in the Western left, which is what we gathered on this podcast to talk about. And I suppose one thing I could say in answer to your question, David, is how effective we found it in 2024 to go on these huge demonstrations in London about Palestine. A group of us went there. First, we had some flyers talking about Ukraine and what was going on there, and then somebody came up with the slogan "From Ukraine to Palestine, occupation is a crime." And I've been very struck by the way in which people on those demonstrations, where there are thousands of people who've clearly never been on a demonstration before. There are thousands of young people who are there for the same reason that, we used to go demonstrating about the Vietnam War in the 1970s, because we could see on the media that was available that people were getting slaughtered because imperialism felt they should slaughter them. And that was an unjust and horrible world to be in. I'm sure that's what brought a lot of those people onto the streets. And that slogan for them was greeted with open arms. And really of course, we would get some, older people, perhaps from those leftist groups or from the Stalinist tradition, would come up and say, no, you're agents of NATO or stuff like this. So, I mean, it's a slogan. It doesn't, that's also not analysis. But I think it gave us at least the potential, the possibility to start a proper discussion with that huge anti-war movement, which, it's one of the things I think that can give us all hope for the future, that, actually, hundreds of thousands of young people do come out and demonstrate about this stuff. In that sense, nothing's changed since we were young. and good for them. And I think having that discussion with them is very important. And in our local, we have a local Greenwich for Palestine group, which has plenty of these young people in it. It also has some of those older activists. It also has some people who basically reflect some of that kind of campus stuff. And we, for whatever reason, we've managed to, have a little space where we can at least start to have that discussion. I don't want to overemphasize it. We haven't sat down and had long meetings about it and so on. But the space is there, and it's accepted that this is a conversation we have to have. And I think that to me is important.
Well, I'd like to pick up on Simon's question about the strength of ethnic nationalism in Ukraine and ask you if you could maybe briefly say something about how you see today the strength of that kind of nationalism. And then also after that, because it's connected, could you just say something about how you see the current influence of the far right inside Ukraine? Because this gets brought up a lot by the kind of anti-Western campists who, in a certain sense, echo the talking point of the Russian state. When, right when Putin talks about the denazification of Ukraine, there are people on the left here who, I think exaggerate the strength of the far right in Ukraine, but it obviously is a real force and it's changed over time. So do you have any thoughts, again, from people who don't really know anything about the internal politics of Ukraine, about, in general, the development of ethnic nationalism and about this influence of the far right within Ukraine today?
Here, I think we should start with a more general issue because, I understand that this slogan that Ukraine is Nazi and so on has been thrown around like that, and it has little to do with analyzing the actual situation there. Well, it is a fact that Ukraine has definitely the most right-wing government and the most right-wing civil society in Europe now. The left is absent in Ukraine institutionally. It's also absent from the public space. It's absent from the media, and of course, it's absent from the streets. And it's not just the weakness of the left; it's a deliberate and engineered exclusion by the Ukrainian elites, many political agents and civil society agents likewise. But this has been so since the Maidan Revolution, and like in the West in general, the whole political spectrum since then has been shifting dramatically towards the right. So Ukraine has been, so to say, in the avant-garde of the Western and global right-wing shift. Russia has not looked much better in this respect. So obviously Putin, who calls for the Nazification of anything, should probably stop reading Dugin and should denazify some of his oligarchs first. That's obviously is one of the consequences of this ideological hot mess that appeared after the fall of the Soviet Union, and when this new ravaging capitalism in post-Soviet countries turned out to be compatible with everything from libertarianism, right-wing libertarianism, to outright fascism. And obviously that in Ukraine, the war created ideal conditions for this right-wing shift and for the flourishing of the more extreme end of this already one-sided spectrum. And what should be recognized unequivocally is that right-wing and ultra-right-wing views and policies in Ukraine are now hegemonic. This does not mean that the ruling elites themselves, that the president and his advisors are themselves somehow passionate ultra-nationalists. They're not passionate about any ideology. They use this cynically simply because the far right has historically been more numerous, more organized, more capable of political maneuvering and political coalition building and so on. And this is not going away anytime soon in any course of this war. Whether this is a cause to support the Ukrainian government or not on the part of left-wing groups is a separate question. First of all, the Ukrainian government doesn't need the support of the left in the West. It has been quite explicit about this. Secondly, this support doesn't change anything materially. What remains is the tactical gain of a given left-wing political actor, the gain that may or may not accrue from experiencing their support of the Ukrainian elites or making a clear division between the Ukrainian elites and the Ukrainian population. And this needs to be decided situationally, and it needs to be subordinated to a particular strategy of these left-wing groups or that left-wing group. Finally responding to Simon's question of whether he would still speak Russian on the streets of Kiev and whether something would happen. From what I know, not much would happen. It would probably be quite awkward to speak in public, and it would not cost him a lot because he would speak with an accent, and everyone would understand that he's just a foreigner and he's trying to, The thing is that Ukrainian elites has not been very successful in establishing ethnic homogeneity or linguistic homogeneity, although they always tried. And they had not succeeded yet, despite all the efforts, despite the laws banning Russian schools and banning Russian books and everything. People are quite multilingual still, and even according to the polls, the very recent polls show that people are not really afraid to even to self-identify as bilingual. I may be wrong, but the order of magnitude is like this, that a third of the population admit that they speak both languages, and in some regions that's over half. So this, but this says something about the mood and the common sense of the Ukrainian people, not about the civil society, which is dominated by this linguistic purity and this sort of ultranationalist drive, and not about the dominant policies that are targeting certain types of memory building, historical memory formation, certain types of linguistic expressions, and so on. So there is still, and that's a lucky situation, there is still much more diversity among the common people that live in Ukraine now and that have emigrated, now are scattered all over the globe. So definitely Ukrainians are not Nazis if you meet them on the street at all, which obviously does not allow us to ignore the issue of the political use of far-right symbols and far-right ideas and policies by the Ukrainian civil society and the government.
To shift now back very much to the so-called West, there's a question I wanted to bring up because it's something that's troubled me just as I've observed left politics in the last number of years, and that's just how often you see people who would consider themselves on the left here showing just no empathy for people in Ukraine, as if somehow Ukrainians, ordinary Ukrainian people, everyday people, don't deserve empathy because of the politics of the Ukrainian government being what they are, and the dominant politics in Ukrainian civil society, and because of the fact that Western states support the Ukrainian state. And it strikes me that it's disturbingly similar to the kind of callous attitudes you find on the hard right and the far right today. If you think of, for example, Elon Musk's notorious attack on empathy. And I think something I've observed as well is the way that some people's attitudes here to Ukrainians are influenced by the way that Western governments support Israel and treat Palestinians and other people in the global south as if they're disposable. And our governments here that adopt racist policies against migrants and other non-white residents, but these Western governments treat Ukrainians so much better. An example from where I live in Canada, the state has accepted around 300,000 Ukrainians as temporary residents since 2022, but 1,000 or fewer Palestinians have been admitted. And if you're on the streets here, wearing a Ukrainian flag as a button, or I guess when in Britain people would call a badge, or criticizing Russia, all those kinds of things are treated very differently than if you wear a Palestinian flag or wear a keffiyeh, or if you criticize Israel. So I'm interested in what you have to say, any reflections on this question about selective empathy and so on, the politics of that. Volodya, do you have any thoughts on that, perhaps coming from your perspective to start us off?
Sure. I think we should admit that there are racist undertones in the treatment of Ukrainian migrants in the West, and you could safely say that there is discrimination. Although I should add that not all Ukrainian refugees that have been crossing the border to the West are treated the same. For example, Ukrainian Roma are not perceived as with the same whiteness. They are always suspected of forging their identities and so on. And in addition to that, there is also a clear patriarchal streak in this ideology at work. Ukrainian migrants are represented as women and children, so they are seen as ideal weak victims, and so they deserve compassion, and protecting them would boost one's Western's ego, and also women and children are docile. They are unlikely to object to anything. They would be good workers, as Western policymakers call it. They will integrate well, so meaning they will do whatever they are told. However, what lies behind this benevolence in general is racial hierarchy, or racializing hierarchy rather. Ukrainians are not as black as people coming from the Middle East through Belarus, who are completely dehumanized as weapons in the hands of Putin and Lukashenko. But they are not as white as the local Western population. I would compare Ukrainians to more of a British idea of a martial race, a sort of alien tribe that is indigenous alien tribe, that is useful for strategic purposes, but in a limited sense and for a limited time. That's why Ukrainians get restricted temporary rights on the conditions that they return home. They are treated as sort of property of the Ukrainian government. And obviously, Ukrainian males are regarded as natural-born soldiers. Recently, European Union has decided to push back Ukrainian males who can't prove that their government doesn't want them in the army. So Ukrainians are sort of living supplement to the delivery of weapons and finances, and they're treated as an additional resource in this dependent war making. The issue of empathy and whether we should all be like Elon Musk, that's beyond my expertise, and I'd not wish to live in the world where we copy the racialized hierarchies of the bourgeois elites and structure our own emotions and our own empathies along the racial line.
Simon, would you like to comment on this at all?
Well, only I think that I think Volodya's used the term racialized hierarchy, and I think that's exactly right. And we've got a campaign here in London about transport called Fare Free London, and we're calling for the mayor to make public transport free as a social justice measure and as an effective way of getting cars off the road. In connection with our campaign, we drew up a report about the problems created for people living in London by the high cost of fares. And while I was doing this report, but together with a few other people, I went to a English language class for refugees in a community centre, which friends of ours had arranged for us. And people who were learning English were sat around the table with the teacher, and there were 7 or 8 women from Middle Eastern or African countries and 1 Ukrainian. And what I was just very struck by the fact that the Ukrainian woman who was in the country as a result of the scheme that Volodya mentioned, this temporary scheme, she had a free transport pass, and all the other people around the table had problems, taking their kids to school and going to do shopping and doing anything because they didn't have a free transport pass. And it was a very living example, a tiny microcosm of this hierarchical treatment of different classes of refugees. But as Volodya said, even the Ukrainian woman doesn't have any of the rights that a British citizen has in the eyes of the state. But she was clearly treated in a better way in respect to, and not only in respect to transport. I mean, there were various other examples that came up of ways that she was better treated than the other people around the table. So that racism and that hierarchy is very, very clear. Then there's a political issue, which you mentioned, David, about, what happens if you wear a Ukraine badge, or what happens if you wear a Palestine badge. And that is also unmistakably and unquestionably there. That comes from the British state. And of course, if we're going to create social movements, if we're going to create a socialist movement in this country, it's got to have running through it a strong moral abhorrence of that racism and that ideological drive by the state to categorize people and to categorize political causes in that way. But also the idea in some leftist heads that you can somehow create a mirror image of that and think that you're somehow better than Elon Musk, I think is extremely depressing and should be rejected. It's just not good enough to look down somehow on Ukrainians who have been caught in some horrendous situation in eastern Ukraine and have decided to react to it by giving armed resistance to the Russian occupation, whether that's whether they've joined some volunteer unit or whether they've signed up to the Ukrainian army. They're doing what they think is right for their family, for their community or whatever, to somehow look down on that person as someone who's less deserving of our empathy than people caught in the situation in Gaza is to my mind, beneath the minimum sort of outlook that we need to cultivate if we're going to rebuild socialism as a real force. I suppose it's worth adding that I had an argument with a friend who basically embraced the position that the conflict in Ukraine was an inter-imperialist war, full stop, and any talk of Ukrainians' right to resist invasion was out of place. And certainly there could be no question of supporting or even not opposing arms supplies to Ukraine. And he said, look at these Ukrainians, they've got a capitalist state to protect them. They're not in the same situation as the Palestinians. And to which I responded, well, if only the Palestinians had a capitalist state to protect them. That was the two-state solution against which the Zionist government of Israel fought very determinedly for the last 25 years. And as ended up in the situation we've seen in Gaza, where there's almost nothing to stop this highly electronic massacres from the air. There's almost nothing that Palestinians have to protect them from it. So anyway, that's that. But I think I think it's important to say, David, that these are conversations about the state of mind and the weakness of our left-wing organizations, our left-wing people, our failure to develop a culture and a basis of socialist thought and understanding about the world. These are our problems, if you like, and I think we should we shouldn't make the mistake of sort of trying to put all this in political terms. I think it's much broader than politics. It's about how we see the world. It is about questions of empathy, which too rarely are kind of put to one side as though they don't matter.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that, and I think it's part of as you say, the culture that we want to be trying to foster, which would be one of consistent and genuine internationalism, and although it's a much contested term in some quarters, humanism, because of the appropriation of that by capitalist, racist ideologies. It clearly is contested, and there's complications there, but perhaps for another episode. As we move towards the conclusion of this conversation, I do want to bring up the question about your thoughts on what people who are living in countries like the US, the Canadian state, Britain, and so on, people who want to be consistently anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist, what approach people should take towards this terrible war that's been going on now for over 4 years, and whether you think there are some useful actions that people can take, even on a small scale, ways to act in solidarity with Ukraine. But by that, I really mean, above all, with the independent democratic union militants, workers' rights activists, feminists, socialists, anarchists, and others on the left in Ukraine. Of course, they are very small and marginal forces, but they still do exist. People who have to contend both with Putin's war and with their own right-wing government. So any thoughts on what people can do to act in solidarity, even in small ways, but without in any way at the same time unintentionally giving political aid and succor to Western governments? And so I guess it's a question about agency, even if on a very small scale. Volodya, any thoughts?
This is a question of a sort of a political consultancy. I'm not, that's really not my job, but I can say that probably that the biggest favor the Western left can do to Ukrainians is to stave off fascization of their own countries, and this malign transformation of Western liberalism into something quite terrible. Maybe less concerned with Ukrainian fascism and more with their own, and this will matter much more than discursive support of the current policies of the government regarding Ukraine. But if a concrete action is considered, it's what I'm talking about is allocation of resources that are scarce. If a concrete action is considered, then it should be premised on the understanding of the populations in need of help, and this understanding should not rely on broad geopolitical considerations within the framework of nation states or I don't know what races. Ukrainians now are not just those who live near the front line, who live in the occupation, who live in the western provinces, who obviously have their own needs depending on where they live and how. But we shouldn't forget that a comparable number of Ukrainians now live around the world, and literally millions, and that's not nothing in comparing to a bit more than 20 million people who remained in Ukraine. So these are all people affected by the Russian invasion and by the consequences of this war fighting in the long term. If we talk about solidarity, then we need to talk about allocation of these very scarce resources that progressive groups, left-wing groups have. And the best option would be probably not to think in these very broad categories as whose passport this is and where this person lives on, or there should be this small logistical and managerial questions that don't have really a universal answer. You should try to find your kind of the group of people, concrete group of people that you want to help. And I really believe that the time for broad gestures and slogans and so on is gone. If you want to help, do something kind of very concrete and small. And this obviously can't be discussed here in this podcast. That's a much more private conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I think one thing we need to do is to, and this really follows on from some of the things Volodya has said there, is to distinguish between, or is to assess our real ability to influence the policy of the state and political parties and whether we think that matters. We do not have a mass movement which can be mobilized to push around the UK government. That's a shame, because we've had that even in my lifetime. There's been examples of times when the labour movement and social movements have been able to push the government around, but it doesn't happen that often. We don't have that at the moment. We can have it again in the future, but if we don't have that, then endless discussions about what's the correct policy for the British state to adopt are in fact taking us into the direction of a social democracy, which, as I was arguing earlier, really no longer exists. I think there's been an interesting discussion, I would say, in some of the Scandinavian countries, which feel themselves a bit closer than we are to Russia and feel the question of military threat more easily. We haven't talked about this in the podcast about the extent to which Russia offers some sort of military threat to Eastern Europe. It's very often exaggerated. But they've had this discussion where, for example, in Denmark, there's a left red-green group which adopted this policy of stop any arms exports except to Ukraine. In other words, not to Israel, no cooperation with the Israeli armed forces, no cooperation with Saudi Arabia and so on, but allow the export of weapons to Ukraine to continue. But I'd say that, apart from very limited examples of that kind, what's much more important is to see a connection with Ukrainian people, with Ukrainian civil society, with Ukrainian labor organizations as part of rebuilding the labor movement, rebuilding social movements here. And in that sense, I agree with you, Volodya. I mean, the best thing we can do is to strengthen the movements here in such a way as to inflict defeats on far right and their friends. I do think, though, that I mean, it's slightly different, David, for people living in the US and Canada, because, notwithstanding the internet, you guys are still a lot further away from Ukraine than we are. There is such a thing as geography. And so for a start, it's possible for people from here to go to Ukraine. I think that can sometimes be useful. There's a danger of it being a kind of performance. But I was up in Scotland recently, and there were people who just returned from a trade union. They had a trade union expedition of some kind to Kharkiv. They went and met trade unionists in Kharkiv and spoke to them about the realities on the ground. And I think that's very useful. I mean, what better way can a bunch of trade unionists who've managed to get a week off work and have found some vehicles, what better way could they spend their time than going to speak with their counterparts directly? I think if it's not performative and it is part of a discussion, I think it's very useful. And I think we can encourage discussion in the anti-war movement. I think we've alluded to that already in answer to some of the previous questions. For example, if the whole, we also haven't talked on this podcast about what does it mean to call for, to ask for, to long for, to want peace in Ukraine, right? This is not a simple issue, and it means thinking. It means it means discussing. It means listening to what Ukrainian comrades have to say about it. It means trying to understand what's the position of Ukrainian people more broadly, So I think it's rather pitiful to see broadcasts of the Stop the War rally there a couple of weeks ago, where a lot of demagogic speeches about how we need peace now, but we kind of need an end to starvation and an end to nukes and all sorts of other things now, but they're not going to come by us shouting at each other about it and everybody clapping. We need a more sophisticated type of discussion than that. And I think where we can open up space for those discussions, that's very, very valuable. And we should do that at every opportunity.
Thanks. And to end now, I would just like to bring up one kind of question with looking to the future. Thinking about the way that the Russian war on Ukraine, I think, is very unlikely to be the last aggressive war launched by the rulers of a major country outside the West. And in a world where Western countries are not the only imperialist powers, China and Russia are clearly imperialist in different ways. Listeners might be interested in checking out some of the previous episodes of Victor's Children, where some of those questions have been analyzed and grappled with. But so here we have, the war in Ukraine as a war launched by a state, that's the Russian state, that's in conflict with Western imperialism, but has become, this war has been caught up in that inter-imperialist rivalry. I think it poses a certain kind of test for radicals with implications for the future, given the changing world that we live in. So just to end things, are there any comments you'd like to offer just about some of the implications for people who are supporting radical social change that would arise in your mind from this war that you'd want to highlight, given the complexity of the war and the fact that the global system is no longer what it was in terms of its configuration at the beginning of the 21st century? If not, we can just drop this and end it with the previous.
That's there are okay. Obviously, you don't anticipate a clear answer, right? So there won't be a clear answer. The thing is that we should just frankly admit that we are not ready for this, unfortunately, as a movement, and we are not ready for this ideologically. So I would say that it would make sense while the world is burning and so on. It would make sense probably to allocate a bit more resources to studying and analyzing what exactly is going on and what awaits us. I think that would pay off, maybe, if not in terms of orienting our actions, maybe in terms of we'll have something to read in prisons, that would be my very partial contribution.
I will express a thought which I cannot perhaps justify with logic, but which I hang on to because I think it's important, which is that history can surprise us in all kinds of ways. And for this reason, I resist having a bleak outlook on the future, such as Volodya suggested, not because I think wonderful things are going to happen or that there's not a lot of bleakness in the world, but because I think that it's also true that history can take turns which we don't expect, and that the mass of people in history can intervene in history in ways that we don't expect, and that's happened in the past, and I think there's every chance that it will happen now or in the future, and will make the picture much more complicated than simply a slide to war and accelerated exploitation. I think that those possibilities are not only possibilities; those realities are very present. But I think other realities and potential for collective action and for change are also present, and I kind of cling on to those because I think morally that's what works best.
Clearly, the war we've been discussing and the current condition of both Russian and Ukrainian societies it's extremely bleak. perhaps I'll just end with a line from Terry Eagleton that sticks with me, which is, there may be no hope, but unless we act as though there is, that possibility is likely to become a certainty. So thank you both, Volodya and Simon, for helping listeners to understand some of the complexity of the situation that exists in the world today. That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.